Hi, so I'll try to keep this as short as I can, but before I get into what my fiance did, I want to explain a little about my relationship with my dad. So, while I was growing up, it was mainly my dad who took care of me because my mom was very sick. I don't want to get into her illness, but I'll say that she was mostly tired and stayed confined to the bed. My dad did everything for me, and I did love my mom a lot, but my dad and I were closer. When I turned 12, my mom passed away, and that really hit me hard. But my father continued to do his best for me, and I'll always be grateful for that. After I graduated and got a job, my dad said that he wanted to move back in with his family and take care of his dad's farm because he felt like I could take care of myself now. My dad was the kind of man who'd first devoted his life to taking care of my mother when she fell sick, and then me, so this was a well-deserved break, and my grandparents were also really old. So I encouraged him to move back in with them to run the farm. He'd done enough for me, so I could repay him this way. For the past 4 or 5 years, my dad's been living on the farm with my grandparents, his brother, and his brother's family, and he seems very happy. They're also very well off because the farm business does very well, and my dad's offered to send me money to help out several times, but I always refused because I didn't want to rely on him too much. As a result, nobody apart from me knew exactly how comfortable he was, and I didn't think it mattered either. Now, about my fiance. I met my fiance, 29, male, about 3 years back at a friend's wedding. He happened to be her cousin. He kept flirting with me like nobody's business and eventually asked me out on a date, which I said yes to. It's been 3 years now and 6 months back, and he asked me to marry him, and I said yes once again. We were supposed to get married in a few weeks, but I don't think that's happening anymore because of something that my fiance did a couple of days back. My fiance has met my dad several times over these past 3 years, and they've got along well. Most of the time, it's been when my dad was visiting me, and maybe twice when I visited my dad and took him along with me to see the farm life. I could tell that he didn't like it much because he liked living in the city and everything uptown. But a few days ago, my dad forwarded a text to me that my fiance had sent to him telling him that he and his family no longer needed to attend and that they'd have a private ceremony just for them later on. But they wouldn't be invited to the main wedding because apparently my dad and his family were costing us too much. He also told him not to discuss this text with me and to make some excuse as to why exactly he couldn't attend because he didn't want me to feel hurt about this. For context, I offered to fly my dad out here and pay for him at the hotel in full because this is the bare minimum that I could do for him as his only daughter. My dad's family, my grandparents, my uncle and his wife and kids, are also invited, but they're paying for their own travel arrangements. But I'm covering the cost of theirs. What my fiance didn't know was that my father was the one funding the entire wedding. Right from the vendors to the venue to the caterers to the organizers. Literally everything was being paid for by my dad because he'd insisted on letting him cover the expenses of the wedding. He could afford to do that for me anyway, so it wasn't a burden on him, and he'd also been saving up for a wedding fund right from when I turned 18, and I thought that was pretty touching, so I let him pay for it. My dad was very disappointed, just like anyone else in my place would be, and even said that now he didn't want me to get married to this man anymore. He said that he'd still support me if I chose to, but also added that he felt that my fiancé was being very sly and manipulative. And this whole thing just seemed very off to him, and I've got to agree with him. I actually did want to tell my fiancé about my dad sponsoring the wedding at first, but then I had the idea to surprise him with an expensive honeymoon in an exotic location of his choice with all the money that we'd be saving. So I told my fiancé that I'd be the one paying for the entire wedding, and he seemed to be surprised at that when I told him. But I convinced him that I had enough put aside to be able to afford it, and he didn't question it too much. I even said that I'd paid for everything in advance, and whatever the costs came up to later, I'd split it with him if it was too much so that he wouldn't be suspicious. I planned meticulously and was very excited to surprise him. And that's exactly how furious I was when I saw that text, and my dad was also really disappointed because this whole plan of ours had backfired. And now my fiancé had felt the need to go behind my back to disinvite my own father, who happened to be paying for the whole wedding. Of course, I confronted my fiancé as soon as I received the text that he'd sent my dad and told him that what he'd done was way out of line. He defended himself, saying that he had to cut someone out, and he picked my dad because the flights and accommodation were costing us way too much. He told me that he absolutely had to cut costs, or else we'd end up blowing all our money on just the wedding. The least he could have done was consult me, even if he did feel like we were spending too much. And it definitely shouldn't have been my dad whom he dropped from the guest list. Not because he was funding the wedding, but just because he was my father, that's all. That's enough reason for me to want him at my wedding. If he wanted to cut costs, then he should have dropped a few of his distant aunts and cousins from the list instead. When I was fighting with him over what he'd done, I also told him the truth about how it was my dad who was funding the wedding. And we didn't tell him about it because I wanted to surprise him by paying for the honeymoon to a location of his choice. But now he'd ruined it all for himself by being sly and going behind my back to prevent my dad from attending, and even tried to cover up by forcing him to lie to me like my fiancé was. But after I told him about the surprise we'd been planning, he turned it around on me and told me that I should have been honest with him instead of playing games and leading him to believe that we were spending a lot more than we could afford to. My issue with this whole thing was that he hadn't had to spend a single dime on the wedding yet, but was still acting as though he was being robbed and was going to end up broke soon. The wedding budget was well within our means and was nothing that we wouldn't be able to afford. I know that my dad was paying, but I didn't want to end up spending the entire fund on the wedding itself because that would just be wasteful, and it was a ton of money too. So my fiancé's reaction was just really weird and unnecessary. Nevertheless, when he did bring that point up, I felt like I might have messed up a little. I tried to defend what I was doing by saying that the only reason I kept all this a secret from him was because I wanted to surprise him. But he told me that that was not a good enough reason and put all the blame on me. So to sum it all up, my fiancé believes that this could have all been avoided had I just been honest with him and told him right from the beginning that it was my dad who was going to be paying for the wedding. And then he wouldn't be worried about money at all. Neither would he have gone out of his way to make my dad back out of the wedding, and everything would have just been fine. But I also don't think it's fair to blame everything on me because I'm sure there were a lot better ways to tackle his concerns than being sneaky and going behind my back to disinvite my dad. I can't find a way to excuse what he did, but I also feel like I shouldn't have tried to hide anything from him at all. We've been fighting for a couple of days ever since he sent that text, and now I'm not even sure if I want to get married. We haven't spoken since our fight, but he's going about his life like he usually does, while I've been a total wreck. I don't understand if I'm really the one at fault here, because I was just trying to do something nice for him. AITA for hiding the fact that my dad would be paying for our wedding so I could surprise him? Update 1. Hey, so I read the comments here and all I have got to say is wow. I actually didn't know I was being gaslit until some of you guys brought it up. I know what gaslighting is, and I always believed that I'd be able to recognize it if it were to happen to me, but apparently not. Thanks for all the support, guys. That was really helpful because at least now I know that this wasn't entirely my fault. He could have just sat me down and talked to me about his concerns regarding the budget if he was so worried about us going beyond our means. We could have discussed it, and since we're just a few weeks away from the wedding, I probably would have told him about the surprise anyway. He has absolutely no excuse for going behind my back and disinviting my dad, because even if we ignore the circumstances and the situation itself, it's still really disrespectful to me and my family. It's also really hypocritical of him because he has still invited all his family, including all the people he barely even speaks to and hasn't seen in ages, simply because they're related to him. But is getting mad over me inviting my dad and offering to pay for his flights and accommodation, which is not even that huge an amount as compared to whatever we'll be spending on his family. I have only a select few relatives attending and a couple of close friends and their partners, unlike him, and yet he chose to disinvite my dad. I literally cannot think of a single situation where something like this could be excused. And I'm 100% sure that if my dad hadn't told me himself, I probably never would have found out about this either. He's just been selfish and thoughtless in dealing with this situation, and the aftermath has been even worse. He's tried to gaslight me into thinking that this was somehow my fault for trying to do something nice for him, and is still acting like he's the victim here. It's been about a week since our big fight, and he's still not talking to me. Heck, he even refuses to look at me or sleep in the same room, and has been sleeping on the couch. This is nothing new to me, because even in our earlier fights, he used to give me the silent treatment until one of us gave in and finally talked to the other. It would usually be me who would break down first and apologize, but this time, it just felt really manipulative of him to first screw up on such a colossal level and then refuse to acknowledge his mistake. And on top of that, he tried to gaslight me and is now giving me the silent treatment because he believes that I'm going to come back to him once again. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen this time around, and I'm definitely going to call off the wedding now. It's been a while, and he's had several opportunities to come to talk to me, or at least try to make things right, but he's not done a thing. So I guess it's pretty clear now that to him, being right is a lot more important than being honest or being kind. Whatever. If I'm being honest, the only reason I haven't already left is because I haven't found a place to go yet. And I don't want to go live in a hotel because I pay equal rent to live in this house. So it seems unfair that I should be the one to leave when he's the one who messed up. Besides, this used to be the house that I lived in before he moved in. And I strongly feel that if anyone has to move out, it should be him, not me. These past few days have shown me all I need to know about my fiancé's behavior, and I'm really disappointed that I didn't realize just how egoistic and manipulative he's always been. I'm glad that he went behind my back and texted my father, because had that incident not taken place, I probably never would have been able to realize that I was making a huge mistake by marrying this guy. He probably still thinks that I'll apologize to him and let this go as well, like I usually do. But he's in for a nasty surprise. It feels like the past 3 years of my life have completely gone to waste right now. But at least I didn't find out I'd made a mistake after I got married, because that would have been even worse. That is pretty much my only consolation right now, and I'm hoping that I feel better with time. Hey everybody, so I finally spoke to my fiancé and told him that I wanted to cancel the wedding today. It's been a week and a half and he still wasn't talking to me. But I thought that I shouldn't waste any more time, and so I spoke to him first, but it was not to apologize as he'd expected. He was shocked and initially tried to play it cool, but when I made it clear that I was dead serious about it, he started panicking a little. He told me that he no longer had a problem with my dad attending and was just giving me the silent treatment because he was afraid of how I might react now, even if he did apologize to me. That didn't even make sense, because how would he know how I'd react to an apology that never even came? He didn't apologize because he was so used to pushing me around and manipulating me that he didn't even feel sorry and didn't think that it was necessary to apologize to me, for doing something so sneaky and disrespectful. And that was the real reason he didn't apologize, not whatever excuses he was coming up with now. I told him that at this point it was too late to fix our relationship because it was very clear that he cared more about himself and his overinflated sense of ego than our relationship. So it didn't even make sense to stay together. If not speaking to me for one whole week and a couple more days didn't affect him in any way whatsoever, then maybe we were better off without each other. He tried to find an appropriate argument for whatever I was saying to him, but couldn't because he knew that every single word of it was true. He knew that he'd messed up, and he knew that what he'd done was unacceptable. He also was quite aware of the fact that what he did after the fight just made matters worse. So now, arguing with me was not going to improve the situation. So once again, he tried to turn the tables on me and tried to manipulate me into believing that I was in the wrong here by bringing up how I had lied to him as well by not telling him who was really paying for the wedding. When I asked him why he hadn't tried to discuss that with me first before jumping the gun and disinviting my father from the wedding, he had nothing to say because he knew that his gaslighting wasn't going to work with me anymore. Now that I wasn't thinking of him with love, it made it a lot easier for me to call him out on his BS because I wasn't afraid of hurting him the way he'd hurt me. He had been super disrespectful, and I was no longer going to put up with him simply out of love. Love simply doesn't cut it if he doesn't even respect me and wants to treat me like a teenager who will always come running after him even if he's wrong. Update 3. My ex-fiancé moved out a few days back, and now we have a new issue to deal with about who's going to pay the cancellation charges for everything. He obviously thinks that I should be the one paying because I'm the one who thinks that the wedding should be cancelled. But I don't agree one bit. He's the one who should pay because it was his fault that the wedding was getting cancelled in the first place. I've offered to split the cost with him, but he wants me to cover all the expenses, which is just not fair at all. And the alternative to that is staying with him, which is what he's been trying to convince me to do. For the past couple of days, even though he's left, he hasn't stopped texting me and trying to get me back. He refuses to back down, even though I've told him several times that I'm just not interested in getting back with him anymore. He thinks that I'm overreacting to this whole situation and blowing it way out of proportion. It's crazy to me that he still refuses to acknowledge how insane it was of him to disrespect my dad that way. Knowing that I'm very close to him and it's practically the only family I have left at this point. He wasn't taking me seriously until a few days back when I told him that I didn't want him to live here anymore because this was my place originally, and most of the things here belong to me. So either he could leave or I would. He left to prove me what a great guy he was, but it didn't do much for me and only made me feel relieved that I didn't have to feel the tension in my own house anymore, and I didn't have to walk on eggshells now. Even right now, while I was typing, he sent me a text saying that he'll do whatever it takes to fix the situation and that he is sorry for whatever he did. He's promised me that he'll try to be better, but it just doesn't mean anything. Truth be told, I don't feel the same way about him anymore. Not after what he did. I don't think it's even possible for me to feel for him the same way ever again, because once you start seeing everything that was wrong with your relationship, you can't just shut your eyes and pretend you don't see them after a while. He was toxic and he was selfish, and that's something I can't pretend to not notice anymore. I'm going to miss him, that's for sure, but I also cannot marry him and continue to let him push me around. For now, we have to come to a conclusion about how we're going to pay for the vendors, the venue, and catering, because there are just 2 weeks to go now for what was supposed to be our wedding day. But obviously, that's not happening anymore. I've already spoken to the people involved, and we only have to pay cancellation charges for the most part. And if my ex and I split the cost, we can easily cover it all without any trouble. And then we'll be able to move on with our lives. The quicker we get it done, the less we'll have to pay, because the closer we cancel the actual date of the wedding, the higher the charges will be. He thinks the only two options out of this for me should be to either get back with him and there'll be no cancellation, or I can pay for everything in full since I want to cancel the wedding. Both of these options are clearly ridiculous and unfair, and I can't even block him out of frustration because I have to do something about this situation and can't just leave the people I was working with hanging forever. So please, any advice regarding how to deal with my ex, who's in denial right now, is more than welcome. Update 4. Okay, so my ex's family found out that I was cancelling the wedding and finally agreed to split the costs equally. Not out of the goodness of their hearts or whatever, but just because they didn't want me bothering their child anymore. Apparently, I was the one being the bothersome one here, but it's cool. At least I got to see everyone's true colors before I finally severed my ties with them. My in-laws have always been nice and civil to me. But the second I stood up against my ex-fiancé, I became the villain. My mother-in-law had even sent me a text saying that she was very happy that I had chosen to leave her son alone because she'd never believed that I was good enough for him, and she'd pay twice the amount gladly if it meant that I'd be out of his life. Suddenly, I was the cause of his ruin and the reason behind all his unhappiness. I was a little surprised at their reaction, but I've accepted it now, since only parents like these could raise a son like that. I've blocked them all now, and I'm trying to move past this to the best of my abilities. My dad is still flying down to see me, though. I'd kept him in the loop about what was going on, and he's kind of disappointed in my ex-fiancé's behavior. But at the same time, he's thrilled that I don't have to spend the rest of my life with such an immature brat. And I agree. I dodged a bullet there. He's also promised that he'll transfer the entire wedding fund to me and we'll take a family vacation to a location of my choice just to make me feel better. As long as my dad's on my side, I can deal with this. And I already feel loads better thinking that I'll be able to talk to him about all of this in person soon enough now. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.